Hey guys, I noticed that a lot of people are very interested in the torque and horsepower videos and how to get the most torque out of your engine. And a lot of people are questioning the way that I do it by using horsepower. And I do something called flipping the formula. It's much easier to do this way. Like when the engineer makes the engine, they actually use torque to come up with the horsepower. But by flipping the formula, it's much easier from an engine building standpoint to actually come up with better torque. Let me just give you a couple of pointers on this. One of the best ways to understand this is putting your spark plug wires on. I've watched so many guys go 1, 4, 3, 2 using the clockwise or to calculate it because the engine rotates clockwise. But it's much easier to count to 4, you guys. You start with number 1, 2, 3, 4, because you do number 1 first, and it's on this side of the engine. Number 2 is on this side of the engine, so you're hooking up both those two at the same time. And then you do number 3 and number 4. So you do it in reverse rotation, the same way you do adjust your valves. I watched a video on a guy explaining how to adjust the valves. 1, 4, 3, 2. Oh my God, I was so confused. Much easier. If you adjust your valves, you start with number 1, you go in reverse rotation, half a turn, then you go to number 2, and then your rotor's pointing at number 2, and then you go to reverse rotation, half another turn, and then you go to number 3, and then you reverse rotation again, and you go to number 4, because you're underneath the car on this side doing number 1 and number 2, and over here you're on this side doing number 3 and number 4. Much easier to do it in reverse rotation, the same way that I do with torque and horsepower. It's just much easier to figure out from a horsepower standpoint how to develop torque when you're talking about an engine. I can't figure things in torque. I have to figure it in horsepower. It's just easier for me, and it might be for you. So if you look to the old interweb, you will see that horsepower equals torque times RPM divided by 5.252. Now you can flip the formula. In fact, I don't have to do that myself. I let someone else do it for me. Here's the website. It's called spicerparts.com. They actually do rod ratio calculations, all kinds of things. It's a really cool website. I use their little calculator. So if you see here, it says horsepower, and you go ahead and you put in your torque amount and your engine RPM, and you come up with horsepower. Okay, but you can flip it by just doing that little switch there. Now you see the little switches over here, and you put in your horsepower and your engine RPM, and you come up with your torque. So it makes it easier for you to figure, and I'll go over this a little bit more in detail through this video. So say 100 horsepower, and your engine RPM is 3,500. Then you calculate the amount of torque that you create doing that, which would be pretty much impossible to have 100 horsepower at 3,500 RPM with a Volkswagen engine. But it's just an easy number. You come up with 150 foot-pounds of torque. Now, if you change that to 4,500 RPMs, you come up with a less torque amount. So the more horsepower you develop at a lower RPM creates more torque. It's actually done. Torque is the thing that you use to create horsepower initially. I'll go over this a little bit. So when an engineer is actually designing an engine, they use the crankshaft length, the amount of force from the piston explosion, and the rod angle, and all this stuff to calculate torque. And then they use that to create at RPMs. They use that multiplier, and they come up with horsepower. Estimated horsepower. And then of course now we have things like CNC and all this. We can really calculate that ahead of time and know how many horsepower the engine's going to make when you're actually designing it. But for us guys at home, we don't have all that stuff. So it's easier to think of it in a horsepower to torque ratio. It's much easier to do. Okay, that's why I do it that way. And maybe you guys will get this that are looking at that. Maybe you're an engineer and you're looking at that going, oh, that's the wrong way to calculate it. No, it's reversing the formula and you're using that to come up with more real life situations to make it easier for you to calculate torque. Because if you ask me how to calculate torque without using horsepower on an engine build, it would be very difficult for me to do. But when you talk about it from a horsepower standpoint and RPMs, it's much easier to do, because if an engine creates horsepower at a lower RPM, it's going to have more torque. That's how the number works in reverse formula. And then understanding things that create torque, like a longer crankshaft has more leverage. So if you go from a 69 millimeter crankshaft to a 74, it's going to develop more torque because there's better leverage on that portion from the push from the rod. At the bottom end, the torque can be up in a really high RPM and still be there. Okay, you might have more torque with a bigger engine that's creating that with a big giant cam that's coming on at, say, 10,000 RPMs. But that is not a usable torque. So when you're trying to create torque, you want usable torque. Usable torque is what is in your driving range. So let's talk about this two different ways, and then we'll go to from a race. We're going to go from a racing standpoint, and then we're going to go to real life things for your guys that are trying to build engines and trying to come up with information for doing it at home. Back years ago, guys would try, V8 drag racing. We got to talk about that for a second. What they would do is develop torque in their engine to get off the line, because you had less risk with the big heavy Chevy or Ford or whatever going off the line without breaking stuff. When you're talking about VWs, what we had is the guys would start out making torque with their engines. They'd go and try and get as much torque as they could, and bottom end torque I'm talking about. And what would happen is these guys were breaking axles and breaking spider gears and breaking stuff like crazy. And so what the difference is, like drag racing with a V8, is they would use the torque converter or the clutch. They'd have big giant flywheels on them, because they're just a bigger car. And they would use like torque converters as one of the best ways to bring, with an automatic transmission, to slip the power in. So you can use a lot of torque out of the line and then slip it in easily. One of my friends has a 4-liter Volkswagen Touareg engine that has most of the torque is all at like 10,000 RPMs. Kind of like you've seen these guys using rotary turbo. You ever seen those videos? They're pretty fun to watch. Things screaming and burning the tires. All the torque is all at high RPMs. And to get that torque to the ground, it's tough. It's a tough situation. So what they're using on that engine is a torque converter and something, I forget the whole name of it all. They have dump valves and all these things to help the transmission slip the power in and use the RPMs at a higher amount coming off the line, but not have it totally hook up and burn the hell out of the tires. So in the Volkswagen world, what guys they used to do, is they would start out with a launch RPM of like 2,800 RPMs. They'd build a lot of torque into their engine, and they would break things like crazy. And this was back in the 80s. Guys were doing that. Now you talk to drag racers, and they're like, no, my launch RPM is like 7,700, way up high. And what they do is they make sure that it breaks the tires loose. And then they use the tire technology that they've come out with now to spin their way into a hookup. So they'll come off the line, break the tires loose a little bit, just enough to get them to spin enough, and then the tires will start to hook up as they go down the track. And what that does is that gives them, because they have they have torque all up at a high RPM, and they convert that to the road. The torque is what breaks the tires loose. Okay, torque is the energy. I don't know. It is like a leverage amount. Okay, and horsepower is what's created from the torque at RPMs. So that gets you down the track at a higher rate of speed. That's what horsepower does. Torque gets the tires to break loose or breaks parts, all that sort of thing. So managing that in the race world is kind of tricky. And that's what they figured out now versus what they used to do. They used to just break stuff all the time. I remember back in one of the revolutionary times, one of my buddies used, I'm not going to say his name, he's a pretty big racer. So anyway, but he used motorcycle drag slicks on his VW because he watched the motorcycles take off and they had all this horsepower at higher RPMs. And he was like, man, they spin their tires and then they hook up down the track. I need to do that with my Volkswagen. And he broke a ton of records doing drag racing back in the 80s, early 80s. And that's how he did it. Used motorcycle slicks. Okay. And you got two to match. That was early tire technology that they came out with back then. And now you can just buy them, I guess. I don't know. I'm not into drag racing. But those are the types of things that I've learned from my friends that I've known for years. I was around all the drag racers back in the 80s and stuff. So, but I didn't drag race. So anyway, that's kind of how it worked in the drag racing world. Now, when you're talking about torque for your drivability, you want torque at lower RPMs. And the easiest way to calculate that is use horsepower. When you go and build an engine, you build it for horsepower. That's what everybody does. Okay. So it's easier to find numbers on that. All right. There's guys out there, they don't say when they have these Crassa engines, they don't go, oh, this thing builds out, 60 foot-pounds of torque or whatever. They go, oh, it's a 60 horsepower engine. They don't talk about the torque. They talk about the horsepower. So developing torque by using the horsepower amount is much easier to do. You simply just reverse the formula. So you can go on that website and play around with it. It's really kind of cool to do. It's, I used to do it the old-fashioned way with a calculator and all that and use the formula. And I used to know how to flip the formulas. I can't remember how to do that now because I'm older and stupider. So that's life, guys. So anyway, and we have calculators and we have websites now, so we don't really need that. But anyway, coming up with your horsepower, where does your horsepower come on? When you drive the car, it's easy to feel that. Hey, man, it comes on. It kind of drops off at, when I'm ready to shift, you can look at your tach and all that and figure that out if you want. I kind of just know by the sound of the engine from years and years of driving these things where I'm at, usually pretty damn close, within a couple hundred RPMs. And I'll drive it and I'll go, okay, so I'm building, my horsepower is coming on around 4,000, dropping off a little bit, about 4,500. And, but it's getting there. It's still pretty strong up in that amount. So I don't want to shift at like 4,000. I'd rather shift at 4,500 because I'm getting a little bit more length out of that gear. And then when I shift to the next one, I'm out of the power band. It's all, drivability. Okay. So anyway, so you figure out where your horsepower is, okay, and try to adjust it. And so you kind of get to know some of the things that work and some of the things that don't work. Like, for instance, if you put too big of a cam in, okay, for the engine size, the horsepower is going to come on way above drivability. It's going to come on way too high of RPM, or it may not come on at all if you don't have enough carburation to get there. So key things to get torque are cam, definitely better than the stock one. The stock ones had torque, but there was nowhere near the maximum torque that the engine would build. The stock cams just didn't have enough duration. They were made for, you can't screw up, okay? Volkswagen made their engines, you know, it's for the average person to drive. If you're trying to increase that amount, there's plenty of room to do so. So your cam, definitely, I would upgrade the camshaft when I'm building an engine. All engines I do, but I don't want to go too big. And here's some of the cam numbers that I like for smaller engines. For torque, I like the 2280 from CB Performance. That's a great cam, has a nice combination. I also like the Scat C20. You might even be able to get it with the Scat C25. The Scat cams are very inexpensive in comparison. There's a ton of other ones. The Engel 100 is also known as the torque cam, but it seems kind of large to me. I would say more for a little bit larger engine. So if you're putting that on like a 1600, it might work okay for torque, but you're going to get a little more top end out of that one. It's going to be towards the top side of the RPMs. Now the problem is when you build more top end RPMs and torque, the torque is at a higher RPM, your torque is going to be lower at the bottom. So it's a sacrifice. So again, you can correct that to an extent with exhaust size. By staying small in the exhaust, that's going to help you achieve flow. Now the easy way to think about horsepower is in flow. So remember I was talking to you guys about water. An engine is like a water pump. Okay, a small engine is not going to pump as much water as a really big engine. The really big engine is not going to take as many RPMs to pump the water, if you think about it as a water pump. Okay, because basically an engine pumps air. But if you think about it, filling a container of water, it's actually much easier to do. So a smaller engine is going to take more RPMs. Is that going to be more usable torque? No, the answer is no. The bigger the engine is going to pump the water easier, okay? It's going to pump it at lower RPMs. So if you want torque, the easiest way is always to go with a bigger engine. It's also easier to go with a bigger stroke, all right? Because you're trying to develop as many horsepower as you can at a lower RPM. So the other thing to look at is the pump's efficiency. If the water or air and fuel mixture, either way you want to calculate it, can flow through that pump easier, it's going to pump more water. So your port work, to an extent, can help with the engine flow, which can also help with more torque at a medium RPM. At the bottom end, not going to notice it much because the amount of air flowing through there is not very much. So a little bit of port work stuff is not going to change it very much. A little it will, but at the higher RPM, so like 3,500 RPMs is enough RPMs to have flow make a difference. So a little bit of port work can help a little bit. So I would always do a little bit of port work on an engine. Even on this 40 horse, I opened up these exhaust ports because they have a really bad angle they have to go through. I just kind of clean them up a little bit. Makes a huge difference in the actual low end horsepower even. Because this thing ain't going to go up very many RPMs because look at the size of the intake ports. They're so small, you're not going to get very many RPMs out of that. The same thing with a single port. Single port's going to max out at a lower RPM. And a lot of guys go, well, I want a single port because it's going to develop more torque. Well, it's easier. A single port, you can't screw up as easy. Okay, you can screw up with a dual port a lot easier than you can with a single port. So a lot of guys want to develop more torque with a single, they say the single port will develop more torque, which is not really true. I mean, just think about this. At 3,500 RPMs, okay, what is going to develop more horsepower? What has more horsepower potential? A dual port engine or a single port engine? Okay, it's very easy to calculate that, guys. The dual port engine at 3,500 RPMs is going to develop more horsepower. Therefore, it will develop more torque. Now, on the very bottom end, like coming out of the hole between 1,000 RPMs and 1,500 RPMs. It might be a little less, but 3,500 RPMs is still in your usable range. You can get more torque, total torque, out of a dual port. So, but it's a little easier to do with a single port because you can overdo it with a dual port by getting too much air and too much fuel into the combustion chamber for the amount of compression that you have to fire it. So that's why some guys like a single port. It's not because you get more. You can get more out of a dual port. This engine in this thing, in this 36 horse, has a dual port head, and it develops way more bottom end torque than the stock engine did. Way more. Also because it's bigger. But with just the dual port bringing in more air and fuel, it's able to fire it. It's able to run it nice and clean. And this thing has amazing low end torque for a 36, for a 1433 engine. It's actually super drivable. You can just cruise it around in the, between 1,000 and 2,000 RPMs. It just totally has good power down low. Again, because we didn't go overdo it on the exhaust size. Exhaust size is another huge thing you can do to play with to get better torque. But if you go too small in the exhaust, you're going to have issues with it not wanting to get up to a higher RPM or to develop horsepower at higher RPM, which you kind of need when you get on the freeway. So you got to figure that out just right. Sometimes you'll go and put too small of an exhaust on, or you go too big. What you're trying to do, again, you're trying to create flow. So when you have too big of an exhaust, okay, it's turbulent, okay? When it's turbulent, when the air goes through turbulent, it's not flowing through, okay? A smaller exhaust is going to create flow at a lower RPM. Therefore, you have torque, right? That's what you're trying to do. Calculate, think about it from a horsepower standpoint. If it's got good flow, it's going to create horsepower. Horsepower down low, it's going to create torque, okay? So that's why a bigger engine is going to give you more torque. A longer stroke is going to give you more torque, okay? A more compression is going to bring you more torque. Longer intake runners bring you more torque. And smaller exhaust, to an extent, will bring you more torque at the bottom end. Flow, if it's turbulent air going through. So if your port sizes are too big and the air is not going, it's going through the ports, okay? And it's not creating flow because it's getting turbulent through the ports because the port sizes are too big for the engine RPMs or for the compression or for the cam and all that, okay? It all goes together. It's going to be turbulent in there, and if it's turbulent, it's not going to be flowing, okay? The whole idea is to get flow at lower RPMs. You can do it by a little bit of port work. So in other words, if you make giant ports like this, okay, big old giant ports, at low RPMs, it's going to be turbulent, okay? So that's going to take away torque, right? That's going to not give you horsepower down low. It's going to give you horsepower at the top, but not down low. Same thing with a big giant cam. It's letting more air and fuel in there, but there's not enough compression to burn it down low RPMs. As the RPMs go up more, then that compression that you have, when the speed of it goes up faster, it's actually compressing the air more, and then it's actually able to burn it more. So too big of a cam is going to take away. The stock cam, again, is not big enough, you guys. It's engineered for just total drivability. They made these VWs with so much room to be improved, and they made them that way so that they would be simple, okay? So that you could do almost anything. You could do stupid stuff in it, and it would still keep going. Now, if you're just not going to be stupid and you're going to drive it like a a smarter person, then you can definitely do a lot of things to the engine to give it more horsepower and more torque and improve the drivability dramatically. And you really almost need to in these roads today to keep up with traffic. You need to be able to power your way out of situations. You be able to stop quicker. You need to be able to, do all the things that you need to do to drive on the roads today. Back years ago, cars like this would break down on the side of the road and everybody expected it. Nowadays, if this thing's broke down, you might get run into because people are not expecting that. I remember coming home on the freeway from the beach when I was younger and seeing a whole line of cars along the side of the road with the hoods up. You don't see that now. I mean, there was a big traffic jam and just literally the whole side of the road would be covered, sometimes 2 cars deep, with cars with the hood up because we were overheating. You don't see that stuff now, you guys. You just don't. So people aren't ready for it. And when they're not ready for it, they're going to run into you. That's just the way it is. So having those additional things to develop more torque, develop more horsepower, make the car run a little better is really, really, really important. All right, so let's kind of go over some of the engine combinations. This one here for a 36 is dialed. This thing's like, if you got a 36 horse, you want to make it torquey. It's not cheap to do, but these dual carbs, that cam, 1433 with the 69.5 and the 81s, oh my God, that is a beautiful combination with this exhaust size. It just has perfect power, and it could be improved. I mean, maybe if I put 1.5 inches on it, or I got 1.25 inches. If I went to 1 3/8 on the exhaust, it might actually run better. I don't know, but it runs so good now. I don't know if I want to change it. It's got a really pretty small cam in it. It's got a dual carbs, even though dual carbs with the long intake runners really work well. Now to develop torque in say a 1600. You could put one of those small cams in, the 2280 by CB. It's called a cheater cam. You can even run it with stock springs. And same thing with the Scat C20. It's a small cam. And the thing I like about the Scat is that it's set up to go with 125 ratio rockers. So you can start out running that. And if you think, hey, maybe I want a little bit more top end, I'll go ahead and put the 125 ratio rockers on it. The same thing with the C25, kind of does the same type of thing. You can add the ratio rockers on it to kind of dial it in after you get it in. So there are kind of a lot of cool combinations with those. Also the Web 86, which is a very expensive cam, kind of does the same thing. And that's a nice little combination. You can run it with no ratio rockers and try it and see if you like the torque it puts out. If you don't, you can always add the ratio rockers and get a little more out of it. There's a lot of different things you can do with those type of cams. The smaller ones, if it's small enough, you can add the ratio rockers and still be under like 430 lift. So you can end up with a lot of combinations. So like, for instance, about 400 lift and about 260 to up to even 280, 278, or I've seen a couple cams up in that range that guys are saying are really good for medium power and torque. Somewhere in there, and about 400 lift, somewhere in there or a little less, actually are good numbers to run with. That's what I would run on a smaller engine. So a 1600, 1776, 1835, even a 1904, those cams would probably work well. And again, if you're going with the larger engine, you may decide, I'm going to put the 125s on it. It's going to give you some decent torque and run pretty well. As long as you do mild porting and stay away from big valves. If you go to big valves, the big valves are going to take away from the bottom end torque and give you more top end. But you can correct that by using a little bit smaller cam. So again, those cams can work even with big valve heads, where you might want to go with the 125 rockers and you're going with the big valves. So you got big valve heads. So let's say you went to the 1968 and you decided, you know what, I'm going to go with the which is a 74 by 92 thick wall. And you said, hey, I'm going to go with the big valve heads. Well, then that's when you want to use the smaller cam. and use the ratio rockers to correct it. So you'll start out with a small cam, try it, run it, and say, hey, you know what? I think I want a little more. I'll go ahead and try the 125s and see if they do well. Those are the things I like to see, because then you give yourself a little room, okay? When you build the engine, you want a performance cam, but you want room to throw some ratio rockers on there if you need to make it in the range where you want to be. So with those smaller engines, inch and a half on the bigger size engine. So 1904 and bigger, you can use an inch and a half exhaust and still have great torque. It depends on your current compression ratio. All this stuff matters. All this stuff goes with you or against you. So if you're wanting a little more torque, you can go with a higher compression ratio on those engines. So if I always say 8 1/4 is kind of the benchmark, okay, when you're building with a performance cam on any engine, okay, start with it like about 8 1/4 or more compression ratio. If you go too low on the compression ratio, it's going to be a sack of junk, okay? It's not going to have any power because it's going to have more cam than it has compression. So 8 1/4, I'm going to say that's about the range I like to be in for most of those engines. Now you can go up to 8 1/2 or 9, and it's going to give you more torque, but you're also going to have more issues with detonation. So it's a balancing act in there. Now you can run dual carbs or single carb. You know, it all depends. You're going to get more top end out of the dual carbs. But if the engine's engineered that way, it's not going to make that much difference on the bottom end portion of it, other than you're going to have a shorter intake runner, which takes away from your torque, is going to give you more top end. With a 2-barrel, longer intake runners, you could do the single 40, you could do the e-gas, or you could do, I use the 2627 old school Weber. They're really hard to jet. I will just give you that. It's not going to be easy. You're going to spend a lot of time jetting, and you better be damn good at it before you try and go that route. So the 2627 can give you amazing gas mileage and give you a lot of power and a lot of torque. So that's what I use, okay? But there's just so many things. There's so many factors. There's a lot of things that I can't, put in this video. If you go, let's say you go with too much compression, okay, and you've got a smaller engine, you don't have enough air and fuel, like you're running stock intake. Let's say I did this. Okay, I got a 36 horsepower engine, okay, and I have that little tiny intake runner, this bitty little thing, it's whatever, about that big, right? It's like tiny, all right? And I run like 9-1 in it. I'm not going to have enough air and fuel in there to burn that, and it's probably going to run on the hot side, because that, if I'm running like 9-1, okay, with a 36 horse, it just doesn't have enough air and fuel going in there. Those are things that you can do that'll hurt yourself, okay? So you got to kind of watch out for doing things that just don't make sense, okay? But if you look at it from a horsepower standpoint, and you think about how do I develop more horsepower at a lower RPM, it's much easier to calculate, guys. That's why I do it that way. It's not wrong, because it's basically flipping the formula, all right? I showed you on the web, it's just flipping the formula and making it easier for real-time people to figure out how to develop torque. So anyway, those are the types of things I'm talking about. That's what I'm saying. You don't need to run a single port. In fact, let's see. There's a guy out there that's running 2007s single port, and I mean it's doable. But he runs so like I said, bigger engine, but you got a small single port head. There's not a lot of air and fuel going through that. And now if you start bumping that compression ratio up, let's say you go to 9-1 with that, you're going to be causing issues with heat. It's not enough air and fuel going into that cylinder. Even if you put a bigger cam in it, it's just not enough going in there to burn it correctly. So that's where people are going wrong. And, but I've seen them slash the compression way down. Well, then you kind of lose the other end of it. So you're building a bigger engine. So you're building a 2007. You're doing it with a single part head, and then you're to get more torque. You know, you're saying, hey, a bigger engine makes more torque, right? And that's true. But you're going and you do it with a single part head, and you take the compression ratio way down, which takes away torque. Okay. So you go into like say 7 and something to 1. I've seen guys do this, and then they slouch the thing out and they go, well, it's a bigger engine, it makes more torque. Well, I can probably take a 1904 and I can put dual port heads on it, and I'm probably going to come up with a better torque number with a smaller engine because I'm able to get more compression in it. I'm just throwing this stuff out there, that there's ways to do this stuff wrong, and guys do it. I've seen tons of engines built that way. It's not totally wrong. It's just maybe it's not the best way. Okay, it's just there's tons of different ways to do this stuff. There's tons of information out there. I'm hoping that I give you guys some guidance in the right way to do it. My favorite thing is, again, cam that has room for ratio rockers, because then you can correct things, because you might go wrong. I mean, I do. I've gone wrong many times, and I leave room. I like to leave room by using that thing for the extra thing for ratio rockers on the smaller cam. If you go with too big of a cam, you can't add any ratio rockers to that. You know, if an Engel 110, I don't think you can add ratio rockers. It'd be like way up over 500 lift or something like that if you added ratio rockers to that thing, or 100. You know, I don't think you can add, ratio rockers to those, but the smaller ones you can. Okay, look at the specs on the cams, and some of them are designed for ratio rockers, and they actually work really good, and they're a little bit softer on the valve seat that way, because it drops it down a little softer. I don't know, instead of, the ratio rocker kind of brings it down softer, I guess, instead of the cam just dropping the valve and beating up the seats. So those are also things to think about, for longevity of your engine. Anyway, I'm hoping this just kind of opens your mind up, and you guys can do the research on your own from here and figure out what you want to do. All right. So anyway, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and see your comments.